Hello and welcome back to another episode of Injustice For All MMA. My name is David, and this episode is for UFC Fight Night, Dawson V Green. There are no robberies. No one got robbed. We'll talk about a fight that people assume was a robbery in a second, but let's go through the honorable mentions first. First honorable mention, De La Rosa versus Aldrich. This was a pretty standard fight. Not even looking at the odds before, but just assuming when I saw this fight made, I knew instantly Aldrich was going to win this. De La Rosa has lost a lot of her fights recently, and I knew this was going to be the same result. Scorecards are unique. I had this 29-28. I gave De La Rosa the first round, and the last two rounds to Aldrich. Interesting tidbit. Before I get into the tidbit, let me display the rounds real quick. The first round, De La Rosa outstruck Aldrich. I want to say about like 4 or 5 strikes or so. In the first round, it was fairly back and forth, right? They were kind of trading shots, really, but De La Rosa outstruck her in that first round. In the second round and the third round, Aldrich outstruck De La Rosa fairly clear. Starting off this fight, I'm glad we didn't have Bisping, but instead we had DC, who apparently just doesn't know how to score cards. It's the weirdest thing. DC thinks he knows how to score cards, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but the problem I had was going into the third round, he was just assuming that De La Rosa lost the first round, that Aldrich was winning based off of what he saw in the second round, and it was insane. Now, the strike numbers were kind of correct. I think they were a little too close in the second and in the third round, but in the first round, I think they were pretty accurate. But for some reason, they just decided, fuck those strike numbers. She's winning this. Whatever. We go to the judges' scorecards, where all 3 judges, Aoriqileng, Saul Diamond, and Shiro Kamicha, all have a 30-27. I personally think that De La Rosa won the first round, but it doesn't matter. I can't even honorable mention this because of just the nature of the fight. It's not like I have a leg to stand on here. We go to the next honorable mention. And that is Demopoulos versus Murata. Now, this is interesting because I knew watching this, and again, back to the commentary, the way the commentary was talking about, and this is I'm not even going to say commentary, DC in particular, when he sees wrestling, when he sees someone is controlling somebody, he instantly is of the mind, oh, that person's winning. That person's winning. That person's winning. And that's just not the case here. Demopoulos versus Murata. 29-28 to Demopoulos. I gave her the first 2 rounds. The last round goes to Murata. In the very first round, Murata had a takedown with very little ground and pound, but Demopoulos outstruck her on the feet, and not only did she outstruck her on the feet, but she outstruck her on the ground as well, on bottom. See, this is the important thing. She was very effective with her strikes on bottom. Murata had, in the first takedown, I believe, very little to no ground and pound from Murata. And Demopoulos is holding Murata's hands and just elbows, constant shots from the bottom that, I don't like using this because I have a problem with it's making him bleed, this and that. I primarily go off of who outstruck who. That's kind of my system. But in this particular case, she's on bottom and she is landing constant elbows. Demopoulos is constant elbows, constant hands. And while DC is going, these strikes on the bottom don't matter, Murata is bleeding. And this round most definitely goes to Demopoulos. Same thing in the second round, where Murata gets a takedown. This time she has some decent ground and pound, but not enough because, once again, Demopoulos is just more active than Murata off of her back. She's more active. It's this part in the second round where DC mentions again, sorry if I'm shooting at DC too much, but DC continues to mention, oh, look at these goofy, I want to say Kong-like hammer fist, where these hammer fists weren't even going to Demopoulos' head. They were kind of hitting her chest, like the chest area, and not even like flush. It was kind of like she Murata landed it, but her hands would slip off. These weren't even, her ground and pound was atrocious. It was bad. And Demopoulos just kept working. She outstruck her in 1 and 2 just based off of her work from the bottom. She was just more active on the bottom. And then round 3, it's kind of the same thing, but a little different in the sense that Murata had a lot more control time. She had 2 takedowns, a lot more control time. This time with much decent ground and pound. I mean, if she had this level of ground and pound in the third, that she had in the third, if she did that in the second and parts of the first, she wins this maybe 29-28, 30-27. But instead, in the third round, she gets 2 takedowns, decent ground and pound, and very decent ground and pound. She continues doing those weird King Kong hammer fists that weren't working. But then the other interesting factor in this one is Demopoulos' activity on the bottom diminished entirely. I mean, she was still slightly active, but not enough to where she could steal this round in any sense of the imagination. And then you end up with 29-28. You go to the judges' scorecards, and all 3 judges all have it the same way. Aoriqileng, Saul Diamano, and Chris Lee all have it the same way. And the commentators were kind of stunned. They were like, what? Huh? These guys, there's portions of this card where they're just talking in the middle of cards, talking in the middle of fights, and they're just not watching and seeing what's going on. And Demopoulos, as, no offense, as annoying as her voice is to me, she correctly was like, now she was politicking, right? It's after the fact. She's talking on the mic, just trying to make sure, DC does the gross thing, which is, are you sure you were controlled for a large part? Are you sure? And she goes, I was damaging her more. I don't like that phrase, but whatever. I was damaging her more. I was more effective. I was landing strikes. That's the correct thing. She was doing exactly what the judges were looking for, and she got the win. We go to the next honorable mention. All right. And that is Hernandez versus Algeo. Okay, I had this 30-27 to Algeo. I put a close marker. On that second round. I think you can argue that round for Hernandez, and I'll explain in a second. In the first round, Algeo outstruck Hernandez pretty clear. In the second round, Hernandez was outstriking Algeo, but then Algeo dropped him. All right, then Algeo dropped Hernandez, like I want to say late middle of that second round. But then Hernandez continued to outstrike Algeo, but not effective enough to where you swing it in Hernandez's way, in my opinion. It's a little close. I wouldn't have been mad, personally, if someone gave that round to Hernandez, but they didn't, and neither did I. And then in the third round, Algeo outstruck Hernandez, and he had a takedown. That's where you get the 30-27. Go to the judges' scorecards. All 3 judges have it that way. Junior Shiro Kamijo, Rick Winter, and Chris Lee all have it the same way. Next honorable mention, Morono versus Buckley. I had this 29-28 to Buckley. I was scared of this fight for a second, because in my head I was like, okay, Buckley should win this, but then I was like, Morono, and they were talking about it a lot during the fight, he's just awkward isn't the right word, he's a very polished also isn't the right word, he's a very good fighter that's awkward to fight against, and for a second I thought Buckley was going to have problems with it, but he obviously didn't. 29-28, first round of Buckley, third round of Buckley, second round of Morono. I'm very surprised. I think I peeked at this already, but I'm very surprised judges did not give Morono the second round. I'm assuming they were just too locked in on Buckley's movement. You go to the first round. Buckley had 2 takedowns. And barely outstruck Morono. They were pretty back and forth, actually. They're pretty close. Buckley barely outstruck Morono on the feet, but they're very close on strikes. But the difference was the 2 takedowns. One very early, and then one at the very end of the first round. And then in the second round, you had Morono barely outstrike Buckley. Buckley was a little slower in this round, and in my personal opinion was outstruck by Morono, but barely, again. And then in that third round, both had a takedown, but Buckley He outstruck Morono on the feet, and he had a lot more ground and pound. Morono had zero, I think little to no ground and pound, but Buckley had a lot of ground and pound. And you go to the judges' scorecards, and it's pretty clear. All three of them had Saldi Amado, Junior Chiricamijo, and Jacob Montalvo had 30-27. I personally, again, I can't say anything, but not even one judge had it the second round for Morono. Also, Junior Chiricamijo, goofball. He gave a 10-8 in that third round. I don't think it was a 10-8. I think sometimes optics look very 10-8-ish. Morono just looked, he was all wobbling all over the place. It looked really bad. I don't think it was a 10-8, but that is what that is. And that's pretty much it. I mean, there were some standout performances. Glenn versus Dober. We knew Dober was going to basically KO Glenn. Green versus Dawson. I was expecting 5 rounds of wrestling, and instead we get a left hand, a straight left that drops Dawson and a KO basically. And then you had Joe Pyfer sub Alhassan. I was scared for a second. I thought there was a part in that Alhassan versus Pyfer fight where Alhassan was landing leg kicks, and you could see Pyfer kind of grit. He looked like there was a potential leg kick TKO, and then all of a sudden Alhassan's like, "Oh, let me stop throwing leg kicks." I'm so lost. I'm so lost on how that happened, but it is what it is. But thank you all for listening, and hopefully we'll be back next week on time. Thank you all for listening, and God bless.